My name is Blaine Brownell. I'm the director of the School of Architecture, and I would like to welcome faculty, staff, students, administrators, and friends of the School of Architecture for our fall 2021 convocation. This is my second year as director, so being in person is a little new for me here with a mask on in front of half of our crowd in person and another half or so online. We're trying this hybrid modality. Might be the way of the future for a while, at least. So what we'll do today is kick things off with our first lecture of our 2021-22 lecture series, Sekou Cooke. And after his lecture, we will have a Q&A panel with students. And after that, we will move into our convocation agenda. And so with that, I will start by introducing our first lecture of the 50th anniversary lecture series. Sekou Cooke is an associate professor and our new director of the Urban Design Program in the UNC Charlotte School of Architecture. He joins us from Syracuse University, where he was a tenure stream faculty member in their School of Architecture. His professional practice, Sekou Cooke Studio, brings thoughtful processes and rigorous experimentation to a wide array of project types, including public, nonprofit, mixed use, and speculative developments. Cooke's current research centers on the emergent field of hip-hop architecture, a theoretical movement reflecting the core tenets of hip-hop culture with the power to create meaningful impact on the built environment and give voice to the marginalized and underrepresented within design practice. This work has been widely disseminated through his writings, lectures, and symposia, and is the subject of his recently published monograph, Hip-Hop Architecture with Bloomsbury Press. And Cooke's work was also featured in this year's landmark exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at the Museum of Modern Art. Cooke is an emerging pioneer in architecture and urban design, known for his innovative, activist-based approaches to elevating Black voices in the field. We are so very fortunate to have him here in Charlotte, and I can't wait to see the positive influence he will have on our community. Please join me in welcoming Sekou Cooke.
Thanks, Blaine. Thanks, everyone. And if you don't, maybe if I stand back here, I can take this off for a bit so that I don't feel muzzled while I'm presenting, if that's okay, everybody. Okay, good, great, thank you. You can also see me smile too, which I like to do from time to time. Thanks again for the warm introduction and just the general warm welcome from everyone here. It's been such a moving time to change so much of my life, change cities, change jobs, change houses. But to have this warm welcome has meant quite a lot to me and just made the transition quite a lot easier. So thanks again. So today, because this is the first lecture of the series and because I'm starting something new, I'm like, maybe I'll do something else new. I'll give a different kind of a lecture than I usually do. And hopefully you know enough about me thus far, somewhat, maybe you don't, maybe you're just not that interested in who I am and what I bring to the program, but hopefully some of you in the job talk that I gave last semester, or maybe if you watch some stuff on YouTube, or maybe you've even bought my book and read the book, that would be great. That you know, so today is going to be a bit more of a series of arguments that I'm proposing, maybe a kind of FAQ, if you will, trying to answer some of the questions that typically come up. And the Q&A part of a lecture is always the most fun for me anyway, so I thought I'll err on that side, even while laying down some basics, some ground information. And one of the first things I struggle with is lecture titles. I've been asked to do quite a few lectures this year, and a few weeks before they keep sending, what's your lecture title? I'm like, I don't know. Start making them up. So I made one up for this one. If this is working, no, it's not working. Does this have to turn on? Let's turn this on. That. Okay, ruining my punchline. There is a lecture title. I did come up with it. Anyway, okay. What else did I want to say? Okay, so maybe I can say, oh, no, where did it go? No, it went too far. That's not the lecture title. That's the one that everybody wants. They want everything to be called hip hop architecture. But, okay. Thank you. All right. There we go. That's my lecture title. It's not so funny anymore. All right. So yeah, so I won't be talking a whole lot about the MoMA show. I showed that in pretty extensive detail when I interviewed here. Maybe there's video of that somewhere, or there's some other YouTube lecture I've done that talks about that. I won't be talking a whole lot about new projects that I'm working on right now, like the Chicago Architecture Biennial project that is going to be released in a few weeks from now. But I will be talking about hip hop architecture because that's kind of the #1 question most people have. So, and yeah, so this is the book from the same name. And this is really, in terms of FAQ, one of the main reasons I wrote this book is to just answer all the questions people kept having about hip hop architecture. It's a research trajectory that I threw myself into for quite a number of years, and connected to some work that was happening while I was in undergrad in the mid-90s. And it seemed like a topic that was relevant 20 years later. And so I delved into it a bit, started to do some symposia about it, wrote some papers on it, and then kept getting the question, what is hip hop architecture? So just wrote a whole book on it. So hopefully, again, if you have that as your main question, you can purchase the book and read it. So the #1 thing that any author wants you to do is not to buy their book, is to actually read the book. So I don't care if you steal the book or get it from a library somewhere, but I want you to read it so that you can engage with me on the topic, right? So I'm gonna answer most of those questions by walking through different sections of the book that talk about these FAQ, these questions that come up over and over. So the first volume, it's broken down into 4 volumes, and you'll notice the square format is kind of an homage to the CD era when we used to buy these little plastic boxes. And yeah, so the first volume is a kind of introduction to all of the theories. It starts with a disclaimer, basically setting up the general attitude of the book, and then a manifesto and a prologue that walks you through how the book is structured. The second volume is really laying down most of the theory, the history and theory of hip hop architecture as a topic. And some of the biggest questions get answered here. So we dive into some really important aspects of legitimacy and authenticity as it relates to hip hop, as it relates to architecture, as it relates to hip hop architecture as a theme. The third volume is where you see most of the work. This is like the imagery. This is all of the contemporary practices that are happening that are influenced directly by hip hop architecture. And then the fourth volume is what I call the B-sides, all the speculations and tangents, all the things that are somehow connected to hip hop architecture, but aren't hip hop in a more intentional form. So what is it? That's the first main question, right? What is hip hop architecture? So the definition, and again, apologize if this is really text heavy today. It's more about laying out some of these arguments. I promise there'll be some pretty pictures later on, but this is how we'll start out. So it becomes really, really easy when you start to think about hip hop, not just as a genre of music that you choose from a list, or I've gotten into watching that show with Jamie Foxx recently. What's it called? Nobody else watches this show with Jamie Foxx. The music show, like you gotta, Beat Shazam, that's what it's called. And hip hop is one of these categories, but it's a culture of people, and this is how people express themselves. And if we start to understand architecture as being one of the primary modes of cultural expression, then we understand that hip hop architecture is not just this secondary thing. It's not just something that we're coming up with as maybe it's possible, but it's necessary. We have to connect these two parts of our lives, right? And the short elevator pitch quote is that hip hop architecture is hip hop culture in built form. So whatever that might mean to you. But in the book, we get into more detail about different theories that people have had, others have had at different times, of how to define hip hop architecture, come up with rules for engagement, if you will. So this is from Andres Hernandez. This is a document he produced in 1998 at a NOMA conference that was in Miami. And you can see he came up with this 10-point platform for what he was calling hip hop architecture at the time. Hip hop architecture must build on existing foundations. Hip hop architecture must wed theory and practice with social responsibility. Hip hop architecture must occur by any means necessary. So you can compare that with what happens with Craig Wilkins, who's also done some really extensive writing on hip hop architecture, where these are his 4 rules for what it needs to be. It needs to be palimpsestic, anthropomorphic, performative, adaptive. So these are how it expresses itself, but it doesn't always answer some of the bigger questions. If everything complies to this, does that automatically then make it hip hop architecture? So hopefully we'll talk about that a bit more. This is another diagram that Craig Wilkins produced. So the first list he produced in something that he wrote back in 1997, 2007. But this is much more recent, when he said at one of my symposiums, he said that hip hop architecture should be a model for architectural practice, period. And that sat with me. It took me 3 or 4 months to digest what he meant by that. And then the next presentation he gave at one of the panels that I put together, he produced this diagram to explain that, where he's saying, architecture, like any discipline, is interested in an object, right? The central object. And for the architectural discipline, that's the built form, the built environment. Buildings are a central object that we're interested in. And the discipline concerns itself with a few things surrounding that object, but hip hop architecture is interested in all these other things, like communal empowerment, environmental sustainability, entrepreneurship, and all these other aspects that he's saying that architecture in general should be concerned with, right? So in hip hop architecture's engagement of these broader themes, these broader agendas that are really important to the public at large, that should be a model for architectural practice on a whole. All right, so next question. Who can practice it and who does it serve, right? So this gets into deeper questions about race and about gender, right? So this might not be as relevant an image now, maybe, trends move so quickly, but this is Iggy Azalea, a Melbourne, Australia-based rapper. And her name in the 2015 Hip Hop Architecture Symposium, her name came up more often than any other name throughout the entire 2 days. Because it gets to this real deep several questions about authenticity, like about identity, about race, about gender, right? The fact that Iggy Azalea created this persona and became a #1 best-selling hip hop artist and also won a Grammy for Best Hip Hop Artist of the Year is part of this larger problematic issue about how do we define who does hip hop culture represent, right? Trisha Rose at a conference that I went to in Cambridge in the UK a few years back said that, you know, anybody can participate in hip hop as long as there's an acknowledgement that this is a cultural form that began with Black and Latino youth in the South Bronx, right? Once you completely divorce it from that, once you don't understand its origins, then you're in a realm that is more about commodities, more about how can it be sold. So, and of course, for us in architecture and the design disciplines, we know that we have this huge race problem. So there are many other scholars working on trying to define Blackness in architecture. The MoMA show that we were in was about defining Blackness in architecture. What is this? Is there a Black aesthetic in architecture? Something that others like Jack Travis have been working on for several decades. But the Hip Hop Architecture Project isn't really about that specifically, because we all know that there's a lot of authenticity within hip hop that isn't necessarily Black. However, because architecture as a discipline has such a problem with race and such a with Blackness, and specifically, it's very, very important for us to amplify the voices of people in the hip hop community within the architectural realm. Okay, and then for the gender issue, so this is more about this is a quote from the book. Again, this is more about the race issue. Within hip hop culture lies the blueprint for architecture that's authentically Black, right? So if we really want to engage with Blackness in architecture, hip hop might be a first place of landing for us to enter into that conversation, right? And of course, all the beautiful productivity that comes out of hip hop culture can be paralleled within the architectural disciplines. And then in terms of gender, we all know that hip hop has this real trouble, this real identity crisis when it comes to gender issues, which comes to misogyny, when it comes to homophobia, when it comes to violence. But I tell a little story in the book as well about how that question was posed to me. Like, I was presenting this as my agenda, and it was really the people reviewing it were basically undercutting my entire reason for researching this field. And the response should have been, it wasn't in the moment, the response should have been that architecture has a centuries long history of being homophobic or being misogynistic or being violent. So that doesn't excuse what's happening in hip hop, but we have to understand that hip hop is just reflecting the culture that it's been a part of. This entire country has a deep history of being racist and misogynistic and homophobic and violent, right? Those are the foundations of our country, whether we want to admit it or not. So to just put a spotlight at hip hop as the problem or the entire problem is not being very genuine. However, we have a responsibility to confront all of those issues directly so that we can really get to the next level. And the last bit that was seeded by that Iggy Azalea image is about commodity, right? So if you want to own anything, you must first name it, right? You have to first define it. You have to define its boundaries. if you want to buy a piece of property, you have to have this piece of paper that defines exactly where all of the boundaries of that property is. And it's the same thing with concepts or ideas or genres or ways of producing anything. If you if you don't, as soon as you name it, then you can own it. Reminds me of this really, this stand-up comedian, Eddie Izzard, a British comedian who does his, he does stand-up in drag all the time, which is besides the point. But he does this joke about people in India who've been living there for forever and saying, this is our land. It's like, and then the British come in and say, but do you have a flag? It's like, oh, I guess we don't have a flag. I guess it's not our land anymore. We gotta walk away from it. So, but the point is that, the hip hop as a culture really is something that defies definition, defies naming, defies convention. It's always changing and adapting and shifting. So this is why I've been so hesitant to define hip hop architecture for so many years. This is why I've been so hesitant to put rules around it. The guidelines by Andres Hernandez and Craig Wilkins notwithstanding. But this is a quote from Africa Bambaataa, one of the pioneers of hip hop, who was basically saying that as soon as rap records got recorded, that was the death of hip hop, right? So hip hop died long before any of you were even, most of you were even born, but any of you even heard about hip hop, because it was this underground culture, this thing that always changed itself, was always moving and shifting. And of course, for me, that's extremely exciting because one, we're not defining a style and a set of rules of stylistic application for people to move forward in, but that it can look like almost anything. And it can change itself almost anytime it wants to. It can become something new all the time. And I think architecture has to strive for that. Architecture of any genre, of any definition, has to strive for redefinition, readaptation, for creating itself anew and questioning all of its underlying precepts every single time. And any student who's ever had me in any class will know that I am always saying to them to question everything, right? Question everything all the time. Okay, thanks. So what does it look like? That's the big question that most people have. Like, what does it look like? If I see a hip hop building, can I tell it's a hip hop building? Is the Gantt Center hip hop architecture? I don't know, maybe. So, but that's the main reason why I created this, which was an exhibition at the Center for Architecture in New York City in 2018. This was primarily to answer the question, what does hip hop architecture look like? So at the time I'd been doing this research for about 3 or 4 years, and the question kept coming up. So I'm like, okay, here's an entire exhibition of about 30 or 40 pieces by 20 or 30 people who have been thinking about this for the last 26 years. Okay, so this is the exhibition that you may have seen images of, and it gave a really great opportunity to explore that from a 2D and a 3D experience. And then it moved to St. Paul, Minnesota later the next year, and got remixed and reformulated. But the installation, the design of the space was also part of that thesis, part of that idea of what might it look like, right? So how does that process go together? And then I'll go through these really quickly. These were supposed to be on like a, I go back to this one, like a 1 second loop. So this is just all the pretty pictures that I was promising you. But again, all of these are in the book, examples that I'm not going to talk about right now of what it looks like, what it might look like. And of course, there's an argument and a description behind all of these. These are images or projects done by students, by theorists, by practitioners. Some of them are speculative, some of them are installed, some of them are real, some of them are works done by graffiti artists who have become architects or have been working with architects, and who are working in many, many different ways. And some you may recognize, some you may be completely new to you. They are all in the book. Okay. All right. What a better question that I like to ask, and that is also presented in the book, is what does it feel like, right? How does it hit you when you enter a space, when you enter a realm, when you actually, whether you enter it or not, whether you see it, how does it hit you? How does it sit with you? And that is a pretty good indication of the process through which that work was created. And this is something that I'm always looking for. I'm always looking to experience it outside of myself. I'm always looking to produce it within my work now. Again, if you do this work long enough, then it inevitably moves from the research area into the practice area, and starts to find its way into your design practice. So this is a place that I talk about pretty extensively in a little story in the book as well. This is a high school on the Lower East Side in Manhattan. Oh geez, I forgot the name of the high school, but the event is called Rooftop Legends, and it's an event that's been curated for about over 10 years now, where all of the New York City's top graffiti artists, most prolific graffiti artists, come on one weekend and completely transform the roof deck of this high school. And all of these graffiti pieces are original, they're new. And if you know anything about New York City, you know that they don't have a whole lot of space for like public playgrounds. So each high school or grade school doesn't have like a baseball field or a basketball court or a soccer pitch. But they have these rooftop spaces that have, they have this grill on the top. So if you have a basketball, it doesn't fly off and fall 10 stories down into oncoming traffic. But this is like the playground area. And so they transform all of the bulkheads and all of the vertical surface into this immersive hip hop environment. And then there's a live DJ playing. There's like some linoleum tile on the floor where some b-boys start to do their thing. There's Jamaican food cooking in the background. It's just this wonderful immersive environment that I had never experienced prior to that. It was, to me, that was truly, or it was getting a lot closer to what I had imagined might be hip hop space. And not just hip hop architecture as an object, but the space, the experience of it. What do you feel like as you're going through it? And then the other example that I talk about in the book was actually producing the St. Paul project. So the production of that was completely adaptive, was completely improvisational. Even though we were kind of remixing up an exhibition that was coming from New York City, the whole space was completely different and nothing worked out well. And the people who again, I tell the story in detail in the book, but the people who were hired to install the whole thing and given 2 weeks to do the whole installation had no idea how to do the installation at all, completely unqualified to do it. And so I showed up 2 days before the opening and had to do it all myself. So I installed this with as many volunteers as would show up, and we had to make decisions on the fly, and everything turned out as it did because of collaborative, live mixing, live architecting of the space, if you will. So both the feel and the process of this space, to me, starts to reflect some of what we're talking about. Obviously, it's not an easy translation between something like this and building a 10-story or 12-story building like we're standing in or sitting in right now, but we're just getting started, right? Okay, so haven't I heard this before? Haven't I seen some of this before? Doesn't all this sound familiar or look familiar? I know I've seen some buildings that might fit into this category. Yeah, maybe. So this is why the fourth volume of the book exists. This is the B-sides. This is where we talk about hip hop artists who have some overlap with architecture. So Kanye West, the most famous one. This is a picture from when he came to the GSD at Harvard. And beyond just a general interest in architecture, he's actually has his own design agency called Donda, named after his mother, where he hires architects to do things like design his sets or design his t-shirts or design interior environments for his stores. Or he's hired other architects like Juana Stanescu and Don Ping Wong, and he's hired many who worked really closely with them and with Virgil Abloh to create some of these really amazing immersive environments. Things like Pharrell Williams collaborating with Zaha Hadid to design shoes, or Jay-Z being really hands-on in the process of creating the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. So there's some of those stories in there. So that's one way that hip hop and architecture somehow conflate. Deconstructivism as a style or as a way of breaking down or thinking through a kind of loose flow of form and space, or breaking certain conventions of construction, kind of looks like what we think about hip hop architecture might look like. And Craig Wilkins has done some writing on this and talked about it quite a bit. Harry Allen, he's a hip hop journalist. He's talked about deconstructivism or Zaha Hadid's works more specifically as something, a lead into hip hop architecture. This, of course, is Gary's work in Bilbao, but this is from a music video. This is from a Jermaine Dupri and Mariah Carey music video where they use the Bilbao as a backdrop. Or Afrofuturism, right? So there is a kind of exuberance to understanding a future that's thought about and designed by people of the African diaspora that is much more eclectic than some of the more traditional Western styles of architecture that we see. Informal settlements, informal architecture like favelas, right? I use this image because it's in the book, but this is actually an image from a model that Christian Querez created, where he designed a new favela for Sao Paulo, which was kind of a oxymoron in and of itself. But the kind of exuberance that exists in favelas may be somewhat related to hip hop architecture, or informal, other informal architectures like this one by Elemental, Alejandro Aravena, and where the architect designs 50% of the building, 50% of the housing project, allowing and understanding that the residents are going to build out the rest of it, right? Or this movement that I'm calling the Neo-Post-Modernists, where people like Kyle Miller are using terms like mashup and remix and sampling in their work all the time. So these are two of Kyle Miller's pieces. And Jennifer Bonner also is included in this chapter under this heading, because she also uses quite a similar vocabulary in her work. But all of those examples that I just showed, none of them are explicitly hip hop. None of them are explicitly attempting to create hip hop architecture, but they're worthy of inclusion in the conversation about how this all goes, right? So last question, is it for us? Meaning, is it for us here at UNC Charlotte, at the School of Architecture, or in the MUD program, right? Is this our new doctrine that we've now all signed on to? I don't think so, right? I don't think it's gonna change everything about the way we do things, but it could change some things, right? And I think the faculty and the leadership bringing me here says something quite loudly about the direction that they all want to take this program or want to take this school. So how do we start to think about these in a more broad, equitable manner? And for just a minute, I'm going to go back to some things that I said in my interview, in the interview lecture, where I talked about the program, the MUD program, being underscored by 3 words, right? And the first is master. So for me, this is about really understanding fundamentals of mastering your craft. So if that's architecture, if that's design, if it's any of those disciplines, you have to have a deep understanding of where this all came from, of how to do the very, very basic things, right? If you are a graduate of an architecture program and you cannot draw, then you have not successfully passed that program. If you're a graduate of an urban design program and you do not know how to read a map, then you probably have not fully mastered that topic that you've learned. Okay, so bringing that baseline mastery of craft is really, really important to connecting back to everything under the heading of hip hop architecture and all the things that I'd love to bring to this program. Urban. So it was really eye-opening for me to just realize that the entire university of UNC Charlotte considers itself an urban research university, right? And urban research can mean one of 2 things. It can mean a kind of old paradigm way of doing urban research where urban is over there and we're over here and we're studying them, right? And we're dictating to them what they should do in their communities, right? Or we are standing 30,000 feet above and we are understanding from a map where to put something and how to do it, right? The second way is a much more integrative approach where you are embedding yourself into the urban fabric. And the urban fabric is not something that's just physical, it's also social, right? It's something that people understand culturally. And if we are divorcing ourselves from that process, if we're not fully engaged in that process, then we're not doing our work as urban designers. And of course, the last word is design. And for me, design is still very important. What something looks like is, and not looks like in terms of, does it match a very specific ideal, but does it actually elevate the spirit? Does it, we're having this conversation with Thomas and Josie the other day about proportion and about composition, that those should not be taboo words in an architecture program or in an urban design program, that we should be willing and able to do all of the good work of designing things and making sure that anybody we design for or design with has the highest level of design approach that we can offer. So with that, let's convocate.
Thank you, Sekou. Thank you so much for kicking us off. Yes, please. Next, I would love to invite Kelly Carlson Reddig to come up, and she is our faculty liaison for the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students, and she will introduce the students, and if the students could feel free to come up and take a seat as Kelly introduces you, please. Thanks.
Hey everybody, great to see all your faces and even a little bit of space between people, but really nice to see you back. My name is Kelly Carlson Reddig. I am the faculty liaison and advisor to the NOMAS organization, and just like AIA has an AIAS, American Institute of Architecture Students, NOMA, which is National Organization of Minority Architects, has a NOMAS chapter. So we are the NOMAS students. Our incoming president this year is Jasir Mills, who is on our panel, and he has also assembled a group of other members of the organization. And so I want to introduce Jasir first. He's a fourth year student in our undergraduate program and incoming president. And we will be having an introductory meeting this Friday, remind me, at 6 p.m. in 290. And we invite all of you and really encourage your participation. We'll be doing all sorts of interesting things this year. And also in our first meeting, we're trying to set the agenda. One of the things that we do pretty regularly is participate in design work and design competitions. And we would love to have you involved. So Jasir is a fourth year student in our undergraduate program and our incoming president. We also have Lydia Chapman, who is a fourth year student, and wave when I say that for you, in our undergraduate program. And Chia Patterson, who is a third year student in our MArch program and in DesComp. And Todd Gaines, who is also in our MArch program in his third year. So these guys are all graduating this year. And Jordan Reynolds, who is also in our MArch program in her third year. So they have prepared questions for Sekou, and thank you guys for listening in.
All right, I guess I'll start it off. You know we're gonna grill you, right? No, I'm kidding.
I thought I answered all the questions already.
No, you definitely answered most of mine, so this will be a little harder than I thought. But I would say, I was talking to you a little earlier, and I'm currently in an internship working with the city of Raleigh in urban design, and I'm actually the only African-American in the entire department. So it's more of, what advice could you give to an aspiring architect or designer of color as far as going into a field that is mostly not, represented with our color. And what role can I play in this urban design center when trying to serve these communities of color?
Yeah, it's a tough question because I think this is the one. Yeah, it's a tough question because for one, I was talking about this the other day there was this excellent DEI forum for faculty that was run by Professor Kaya Dunn last week, and talking about the kind of when you're such a minority in terms of representation, you often fall into the trap of being like having to represent your entire community, right? You have to represent your entire gender, you have to represent your entire race, you have to be the kind of poster child for everything Black and female, right? So it's a tough position to be in, and I don't know if I have any really good advice except for just like do the things that you want to do as much as you want to do them. You have to, especially when you're starting in the profession, you have to be really, really teachable. You have to recognize that you're going to learn much more in the first year of practice than you did in 4 years or 3 years or 5 years of architecture school. It's not to say that what you learn in architecture school isn't useful. That is the foundation. You have to build from that foundation. But then the learning curve is incredibly steep. And so you have to learn all of those fundamental things. You have to learn your craft. Just as I said at the end, mastery. You have to master your craft. But then you get to a point where you have a certain level of mastery and a certain level of responsibility and respect within your field. And then you can start to assert, okay, these are the things that I am really interested in. These are the things that I want to bring to the table. And those things may or may not be things that are specifically about how you identify, right? They might have nothing to do with you being a woman, have nothing to do with you being straight or gay, have nothing to do with you being black, white, or anything else, right? But you need to be at that place where you can assert that these are the things that I want to do. These are the things that I'm interested in. These are the communities that I want to work with. These are the things that I want to serve. So it's a tough trap because, you know, and we find it in academia. It's you know, at some point I'm kind of expected, not vocally, but kind of, it's kind of understood generally that I'm expected to do Black work, right? Or do work about Blackness in architecture. And some people luckily have been able to defy that. And, you know, you look at Sean Canty's work and it's amazing work. And it's just completely secondary to the fact that he's a Black practitioner, right? I wish I had a whole list of other people that I could say, but it's such a small, highly underrepresented field that it's hard for any of us to operate outside of that, because there's a huge vacuum of people doing this work for these communities that, you know, I came to a point in my life where it's like, if not me, then who, right? If not now, then when?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry. So I noticed when I was doing research into you in one of your previous lectures, as you were getting closer and talking about the exhibit Close to the Edge, I noticed in one picture there was a certain quote that says, "They say form follows function, and if you just function properly, things will form." And I know it was a lyric, but as I was listening to you talk and even just doing my own due diligence and looking into your projects you've worked on, how exactly would you say that hip hop architecture utilizes abandoned artifacts like shipping containers, or even like the precedent that you mentioned from, I think it was ITN, the firm in Australia, where they use a decommissioned sort of train car? Like, how is it important for this type of architecture to use these spaces or these items to reclaim existing spaces?
Yeah. So you'll see in a lot of the work that was in the exhibition and some of the work that I'm starting to do now, the use of the existing is something that's one of the themes that exists, that's always through there. And in the 10 points of hip hop architecture, it was like the number, like it must build on existing paradigms. And in Craig Wilkins' 4 points, it has to be adaptive, right? It has to be adapting to its context and adapting existing things that are there. And that's just the power of, when we look at all aspects of hip hop culture, it's always built on something that was there before. DJs are always using pieces and samples of some kind of musical, some kind of music that existed before it and bringing it all together. You know, graffiti artists are always working on some kind of, their canvas is not a new white canvas, it's the city that exists, right? And same thing with b-boys, that there are always performing in spaces that are given spaces, leftover spaces, spaces that are not necessarily dance spaces, right? And I think that's incredibly powerful thing for architecture and architects to think through, because you know, and it's becoming more and more relevant now that we talk more about sustainability, embodied carbon, embodied energy in existing buildings. But it's also incredibly powerful to to bring back and understand layers of histories that may have been lost. Again, I didn't present the project I did for MoMA, but that was all about exposing all of these lost layers of history from placing and displacing and replacing Black cultures and Black peoples in different parts of different cities. And the buildings, the built fabric that was torn down for urban renewal, like how can we preserve some kind of memory of that? How can we trace that again? So sometimes it's using a shipping container. You know, I'm using a shipping container again for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And I'm like, oh God, I don't want to be the shipping container guy, but it made sense because they had a shipping container on the site that they were using for bicycle storage. So this one is kind of a riff off of that one. But it's also revealing other layers of the history of the place through murals and different things that will be part of that, and tracing different areas on the ground from the buildings that were destroyed. But yeah, I think what those specific materials are isn't as important as the fact that it's acknowledging that there was a there before you worked there. You know, when I was in undergrad, there was one of the myths that was constantly perpetuated was the tabla rasa, which is like the kind of blank slate, the flat ground that's white and pure, and then that's where you start design from, and nothing could be further from the truth. Like everything, the tabla rasa really is a myth. Like there is no tabla rasa. We're always starting, even if it's an empty lot, there's always something, some history, something there to be working from.
Thank you.
So as someone who kind of enjoys fashion and architecture, one project I really liked was the skin lingerie retail space that you did,
Okay.
and how you merged the two together. So my question is, what would you consider to be good practices to continue to allow those two mediums to interact in the effective way that you did?
Yeah, yeah, fashion and architecture is, I'm glad it's probably one of those subdued themes in my work. It's not really on the surface. It's something I love. I have many, it's on the list of research topics that are kind of on the side of things that I may or may not pick up later on. But yeah, I think there's quite a lot of scholarship that's out there already around the relationship between architecture and fashion, or just thinking about buildings and how we layer surfaces on buildings as we would drape the body, or different things like that. There might be more immediate parallels within interior design and interior architecture, how we deal with materials and surface and how we directly interact with them. There's a lot we can learn from them, but they're all just different ways of self-expression, artistic expression. You know, in the hip hop world, fashion is one of the primary identifying forces of hip hop. And it's one of the ways that almost all of us intersect with hip hop culture in one way or another through our personal fashion, you know, like, and yeah, there's a lot to learn from and a lot to explore there. I'd like to say that I'm a fashion conscious person, but you know, how it manifests in the work, I'm not sure it's as explicit yet as I would like it to. I think there's always, like in the skin store and in the exhibition, I keep using other, like, there's so many different excuses I come up with, for lack of a better word, for creating layered surfaces, things that are draped with something else, a kind of reskinning of things from the inside or from the outside. I could make up some really fantastic way of making that all make sense, but it's just kind of cool.
So in your book, you talk a little bit about gentrification and just how it,
The book.
I read the summary on Amazon. I'm sorry, but I didn't steal it though.
Yeah,
So
there you go.
that's good.
Go.
So you talk about gentrification and how it generally ignores those who are already marginalized and already oppressed. And in Charlotte, that has been a really prevalent thing. There are so many neighborhoods, like especially in South End, that are just really heavily gentrified. And it's displaced a lot of people from their homes. And so can you elaborate on just generally like dangers of gentrification and offer maybe some solutions for how gentrified neighborhoods can recover from this sort of discrimination?
All right, take notes. I'm going to solve gentrification right now. Got the solution. No, obviously I don't have a solution for gentrification. And yeah, the South End is kind of gone, right? It's kind of done. And in some senses, that is kind of that whole area is kind of a new urbanist dream, right? Like everything is by all of the perfect new urbanist principles, by the book, and it's beautiful and it's amazing and it works really, really well for this many people, right? And I think we just all generally have to just have a wider perspective, a broader understanding of how people actually live in space, and they're not just generic people, they're real people. They're human beings with stories and families and histories and legacies. Once we start to get more personal and less, this is one of the worst side effects of the pandemic has been that we're actually more distant from each other. We're getting so comfortable with being distant from each other. And just as we were starting to recover from that, now we're back in it again. And it's like, it's really detrimental to our understanding of ourselves as human beings, right? And once we start from that point, then we have a more empathetic way of dealing with everything, right? And then we're not doing what I was talking about before, having the 30,000-foot view and drawing little lines on a map and saying, okay, we're going to put this here and this there. We're actually going to the place and saying, okay, what is here? What can we amplify here? What can we change here? What can we adapt here? What can we make better? What can we make different? And it might connect to larger understandings of tactics versus strategies, right? So strategies are much more wholehearted. They assume a kind of norm for the majority of people that's going to work for everybody. But tactics are more about the individual, more about individual instances, individual contexts, individual spaces. And I think we need to be more generally tactical than strategic in dealing with urban challenges and urban design approaches. And it's the kind of cop-out answer might be that, oh, this is all policy, it's about economics, it's not really the realm of the architect. But I really do believe that design can influence policy instead of the other way around, where we are trained over and over again to walk within the lines, to follow the rules, to work in a way that is in line with the guidelines and the rules and the policies that are in front of us, instead of questioning everything, questioning all of those policies, and design in a way that's so clear and so and so convincing that the policy has to change.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm inspired by the intentionality of your work and manifesto. And as an immigrant and now African-American, I developed the understandings of my cultural landscapes back in Nigeria and here, which have greatly influenced my design focus. My question to you is there an experience or perception of your own upbringing in Jamaica and even here as an immigrant and designer, which inspires your thinking, responsibilities, and goals as a designer?
Yeah, thanks. So absolutely. I think so. So I've been still piecing together all these little administrative things to get settled and get up and running here in Charlotte. And one of them was my profile on the website, and somehow one version of it had edited out the Jamaican born part. And my assistant was like, no, we have to have the Jamaican born because it's so important to my identity, to who I am. And you know, I'm thankful all the time that I was born in Jamaica, that I grew up in Jamaica, that I have that kind of sensibility. It's this place that's so small but so big globally in terms of its perception. And, you know, you can thank people like Bob Marley or Usain Bolt for things like that. But Jamaicans are naturally exploratory people. So there's a theory that there's twice as many Jamaicans living outside of Jamaica than in Jamaica. There's a Jamaican community in almost any country or any city that you've ever been to. So we and that's part of what I think influences my design sensibilities as well. So I was talking to a couple MUD students just before this talk about travel and the importance of travel as a designer. Being able to see different cultures and different contexts and different ways that people live, different ways that people decide how they want to communicate and live together amongst each other is incredibly important for a designer. Designers have to have a multiplicity of perspectives. It's so limiting to design from just a single lens. Like any architect who's born in one place, raised in that same place, went to school in that same place, and practices in that same place, to me, is not going to get nearly as much respect as anybody who's done much more traveling, right? You have to be, I know it's really restrictive right now, but you have to strive to travel as much as you possibly can. This is why travel programs are so integrated within architecture schools all over the place and in our school as well. But it also comes back to this adaptive quality that we're talking about before, like using existing contexts, adapting, like using materials in adaptive ways or in ways that they weren't expected to be used. Things that you know, walls that become floors, or roofs that become walls, or materials that are used in completely unexpected ways. And that's related to one of these really beautiful precepts in Jamaica called turn your hand, make fashion, meaning that it's kind of a turn of hand makes it a fashion. Like it takes something that was, oh, I just had to do this, but now I'm going to make it into something that's now fashionable, something that's cool. And that's really embedded within hip hop culture, and it's embedded within my own identity. And I think it should be general knowledge that hip hop culture in general is deeply influenced by and connected with Jamaica as a place. So I'm really, really happy about that continuity within my work.
Thank you.
All right, let's have a round of applause for Sekou and all of our student panelists. Thank you.